You've reportedly placed FBI employees responsible for investigation January 6 cases on leave. Is that keeping up your promise of no politicization, no retribution?
It is, because that's wildly inaccurate. Let me tell you what the FBI has done since I got there. 8,276 federal arrests to 820 kilograms seized of fentanyl. That's enough to kill 250,000 people. Over 3,000 firearms seized, 350 gang cases, 3,000 cases against violent
Well,
criminals.
that's not my
doing the work.
question.
3 minutes ago, Patty Murray walked into a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing and did something nobody in that room was prepared for. She did not ease into it, did not test the temperature, did not waste time with polite overtures or procedural throat clearing. She entered with purpose, with timing that felt calculated down to the second, and the effect was immediate. When she sat down and placed a thick red folder marked confidential on the desk in front of her, the energy in the room shifted in a way that seasoned reporters instantly recognized. This was not going to be a routine oversight hearing, and everyone present knew it before she ever said a word. The room itself only amplified that feeling. Senate Office Building Room 216 has seen its share of political theater, but that morning it felt different, heavier, almost compressed. Wood-paneled walls closed in around the long dais. C-SPAN cameras were positioned at their usual 3 angles, and the gallery was packed well beyond what the agenda alone would have justified. Reporters filled every seat, laptops open, phones ready, many of them tipped off in advance that something unusual was coming. This was not speculation, it was instinct, the collective sense that when a senator walks in carrying only one folder and nothing else, she is not there to ask friendly questions. At the witness table sat Kash Patel, FBI Director, dressed in a dark suit with a red tie, posture straight, expression composed. It was the look of a man who had been through this drill countless times, who knew how to manage the clock, how to deflect without appearing evasive, how to speak in paragraphs that sounded informative while revealing almost nothing. 3 lawyers flanked him, one on each side and one slightly behind, with 2 aides seated just out of frame. It was a standard formation, the kind that signals preparation and confidence. Patel checked his watch once, adjusted his microphone twice, and looked bored, as if this were just another line item on an overstuffed schedule. For the first 40 minutes, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Committee members asked about budget allocations for FBI field offices, personnel transfers, counterterrorism briefings, and interagency coordination. Patel answered smoothly, giving practiced responses that acknowledged concerns without committing to anything concrete. He ran out the clock efficiently, the way experienced witnesses do, and no one pushed hard enough to disrupt his rhythm. From the outside, it looked like another hearing destined to fade into the archives, unremarkable and forgettable. Then Patty Murray's turn came, and the temperature dropped. She did not raise her voice, did not adopt an aggressive posture, did not signal confrontation in any obvious way. Instead, she spoke calmly, almost softly, the kind of calm that seasoned political observers know to fear. When she said, "Director Patel," the room went still, because there was something in her tone that suggested she already knew the answers to the questions she was about to ask. She did not glance at her colleagues or shuffle papers. Her eyes were fixed on Patel, unwavering. "I want to talk about classification protocols," she said, and Patel nodded slightly, as if welcoming the topic. "Of course, Senator," he replied, ready to deliver the standard explanation. But Murray did not let him settle into that comfort. She continued without missing a beat, explaining that she wanted to understand why certain documents previously cleared for congressional review had been reclassified since Patel became FBI director. The question landed cleanly, precise, and narrow, and Patel's expression did not change, though a closer observer might have noticed his left hand flattening slightly against the table. Patel began to respond with the familiar language of bureaucracy, referencing routine procedures and mandated reviews, but Murray cut him off, not sharply, but decisively. She clarified that she was not asking about routine procedures, she was asking about specific documents. Then she opened the red folder. The sound was barely audible, but the effect was immediate, as if oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Whatever was inside that folder, everyone could tell it mattered. Murray read from the first page, her voice steady as she cited a directive issued on March 22nd of that year, ordering an expedited review of documents related to what Patel's office had described as sensitive ongoing matters involving current and former government officials. Patel sat perfectly still, eyes forward, shoulders squared. When he tried to deflect by claiming he needed to see the specific document she was referencing, Murray shut that down instantly. She told him he had signed it, and the silence that followed was not polite or procedural. It was heavy, uncomfortable, the kind that presses down on everyone present. She pulled out another document and identified it as the memo itself, signature included, offering to hold it up for the cameras. One of Patel's lawyers leaned in to whisper something, but Patel shook his head slightly, declining the advice. He attempted to regain control by explaining that classification decisions are based on national security considerations and investigative interests, but Murray interrupted again, this time by finishing his sentence for him. She said the quiet part out loud, accusing the process of protecting powerful people from accountability, and the words hung in the air like smoke. Patel rejected that characterization, but the denial felt thin, almost reflexive. Murray moved on without waiting for him to recover, flipping to another page and introducing an internal FBI memo obtained through a whistleblower complaint. She stated plainly that 37 documents had been reclassified between March and July, all previously cleared for release, all containing information about individuals in positions of power. She looked directly at Patel and told him that was not national security, that it was a pattern. At that point, the hearing crossed a line from tense to explosive. Murray paused briefly to address the audience, urging viewers to stay engaged, but the real audience was the one in the room, and they were transfixed. Patel tried to push back, accusing her of drawing conclusions from incomplete information, but she cut through that defense by invoking the whistleblower directly. She revealed that the source worked on the FBI's Classification Review Board and had been disturbed enough to come forward with evidence. She produced another document, this one marked by colored tabs, and identified it as a sworn statement from an FBI analyst with 15 years of experience. She did not name them, citing protection concerns, but she read portions of their testimony aloud. The gallery erupted in whispers as reporters typed furiously, recognizing the significance of what they were hearing. According to the statement, there had been systematic efforts to reclassify documents already cleared for release, driven by a directive from the director's office, prioritizing documents that mentioned specific names. Murray looked up from the page and asked Patel if it sounded familiar. In the span of 30 seconds, his face cycled through surprise, calculation, and anger before settling into a blank mask. He claimed he could not comment on allegations from an unnamed individual, but Murray was already moving on. She told him she would be more specific, and she began listing the documents themselves. As she identified visitor logs from a private residence in Palm Beach, witness testimony from an individual who worked there, and flight manifests showing travel patterns over more than a decade, the room fell completely silent. One committee member audibly gasped, and Patel's hands pressed flat against the table. Murray made it clear that all 12 documents she cited were connected to the same investigation, all previously cleared, all reclassified within months of Patel taking office. She asked him directly what national security interest was served by hiding visitor logs from 15 years ago. Patel tried to stall, claiming he could not answer without reviewing the documents, but Murray did not let him hide behind that excuse. She reminded him that he was the one who ordered them reclassified. The atmosphere shifted again, not just Murray pressing Patel, but the entire room leaning forward collectively. Then she asked the question that changed everything, asking whether he personally ordered the reclassification of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's associates. The name hit like a bomb. Epstein. The connection everyone had whispered about for months was now on the record, stated plainly, without hedging. Patel's face went pale under the lights, and his response sounded defensive, rehearsed, and insufficient. Murray demanded a yes or no answer, and the silence that followed stretched painfully long. When Patel finally spoke, he claimed he could not answer without compromising something, and Murray pressed him on whether that was because he could not or would not. She then revealed a final document, a single page listing 17 names, all appearing in documents reclassified under Patel's directive, all connected to Epstein, all powerful figures. She refused to read the names aloud, choosing instead to submit the list under seal, and demanded an explanation under oath. Patel looked to his lawyers and found no help. Murray challenged him to release the documents, pointing out that he had the authority and had used it before. As the accusation hung in the air, Murray laid out the pattern again, calmly and relentlessly, and Patel could not offer a legitimate justification. When she concluded, the hearing technically moved on, but no one was listening anymore. The moment had already happened, and the consequences were already unfolding. No one in that room needed to be told that something irreversible had just occurred. Even as Murray gathered her papers and leaned back slightly in her chair, the air remained thick, charged with the awareness that the hearing had crossed from oversight into exposure. Patel sat frozen for a moment longer than necessary, eyes fixed forward, as if movement itself might betray him. His lawyers shifted in their seats, their earlier confidence gone, replaced by the frantic calculation of damage control. The audience, both in the room and watching from afar, sensed it instinctively. This was no longer a matter of partisan sparring, it was a reckoning unfolding in real time. Patel attempted to reassert control as the chair recognized the next senator, but the momentum had shifted beyond his reach. His answers to subsequent questions, whether about cybersecurity threats or field office staffing, sounded hollow and perfunctory, stripped of the authority he had projected earlier. Every word he spoke now was filtered through the exchange with Murray, reinterpreted in light of what had just been revealed. Reporters barely glanced up as he spoke, already clipping footage and drafting alerts. The story was no longer what Patel said next, but what he had failed to say when it mattered. Murray, for her part, did not gloat or linger on the confrontation. She sat composed, almost restrained, as if she had simply done her duty and expected the consequences to follow on their own. That restraint only sharpened the impact of her accusations. She had not raised her voice, had not indulged in rhetorical flourishes, had not leaned on insinuation alone. She had brought documents, dates, numbers, and sworn testimony, and she had placed them squarely on the record. The contrast between her calm precision and Patel's visible unease was impossible to ignore. In the gallery, seasoned journalists exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. They had seen contentious hearings before, dramatic confrontations designed for headlines and little else. This felt different. There was a sense that the pieces had been arranged too carefully for this to be a mere performance. Murray had not stumbled into the Epstein connection accidentally, nor had she floated it as a vague suspicion. She had built to it methodically, step by step, until the name itself felt inevitable rather than sensational. What made the moment so powerful was not just the invocation of Epstein, but the framework Murray had constructed around it. By the time she asked Patel whether he had ordered the reclassification of documents related to Epstein's associates, the question almost answered itself. She had already established the directive, the timeline, the number of documents, and the internal alarm raised by a veteran analyst. She had already shown that these were not random files, but a cohesive set tied to a single investigation. Patel's silence, stretched across those long seconds, felt less like deliberation and more like confirmation. Inside Patel's legal team, the calculation shifted from defense to survival. Every possible response carried risk. A denial could be challenged with documents. An admission would invite subpoenas and potential criminal exposure. Even procedural explanations sounded hollow now that the pattern had been laid bare. The lawyers knew, and Patel knew, that this was no longer about managing the hearing. It was about the investigations that would follow, the questions from the Justice Department, and the scrutiny from Congress that would not dissipate overnight. Murray's decision not to read the 17 names aloud was as strategic as everything else she had done that morning. By withholding them, she denied Patel the opportunity to deflect or preemptively attack the individuals involved. At the same time, she made clear that the list existed, that it was real, and that it was now part of the official record under seal. The implication was unmistakable. The names would surface eventually through lawful processes, and when they did, the trail would lead back to this moment. As the hearing room emptied, staffers moved quickly, collecting documents and whispering into phones. The usually orderly exit dissolved into controlled chaos, with reporters clustering in hallways and producers scrambling to book legal analysts. Within minutes, clips of Murray's exchange with Patel began circulating online, stripped of context, but powerful enough on their own. The phrase 37 documents trended almost immediately, followed closely by reclassified and Epstein. The speed with which the narrative took hold underscored just how primed the public had been for this revelation. Cable news networks interrupted regular programming, replaying the moment Patel fell silent again and again. Commentators dissected his body language, his pauses, the slight tremor in his hands. Legal experts debated whether his actions constituted obstruction or abuse of authority, while former FBI officials weighed in on classification protocols. Some tried to frame the issue as bureaucratic overreach, others as a necessary safeguard. But even the most cautious voices struggled to reconcile the pattern Murray had described with benign intent. Behind the scenes, within FBI headquarters, the mood reportedly shifted from concern to outright panic. Staffers who had worked on classification reviews wondered whether their decisions would now be scrutinized retroactively. Those who had followed the directive without question questioned whether loyalty had come at too high a price. Whistleblower hotlines, already active, buzzed with renewed urgency. Murray's disclosure had not just exposed a potential scandal, it had cracked open a system that many believed was sealed shut. What distinguished this moment from countless other political firestorms was its grounding in process rather than personality. Murray had not accused Patel of malice outright. She had accused him of using a system designed to protect national security as a shield for something else. That distinction mattered. It shifted the focus from intent to outcome, from speculation to documentation. It forced observers to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that power often hides behind procedure, and that abuse does not always announce itself loudly. Patel's defenders moved quickly, issuing statements that emphasized the complexity of classification decisions and warned against politicizing national security. They argued that the mere existence of reclassification did not prove wrongdoing. But those arguments rang hollow in the face of Murray's evidence. 37 documents, all previously cleared, all reclassified within a narrow window, all tied to one investigation, was not a coincidence easily dismissed. The defense sounded less like an explanation and more like a stall. For Murray, the hearing was never about a single man. It was about exposing a mechanism that allows the powerful to insulate themselves from scrutiny. By connecting Epstein's network to contemporary classification decisions, she forced a conversation many in Washington had avoided for years. Epstein's crimes were no longer abstract, relegated to the past. They were linked, directly and concretely, to present-day decisions made by those entrusted with the public's faith. As the day wore on, questions multiplied rather than faded. Would Congress subpoena the reclassified documents? Would the Justice Department open an inquiry into Patel's directive? Would additional whistleblowers come forward now that one had been publicly validated? Each unanswered question added to the sense that this was only the beginning. Murray had lit a fuse, and no amount of procedural language could extinguish it. The hearing had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would be measured in months, perhaps years. For Patel, the controlled confidence he had displayed at the outset was gone, replaced by an image of a man cornered by his own decisions. For Murray, the moment solidified her role not just as a senator asking tough questions, but as someone willing to confront a system that thrives on silence. And for the public, it was a rare glimpse behind the curtain, a reminder that accountability, when it comes, often arrives quietly, armed with documents rather than slogans. The real shockwave did not come from what was said in the room, but from what followed once the doors closed and the microphones went dark. In Washington, perception often hardens faster than fact, and by early afternoon the perception was already set. Patty Murray had not merely embarrassed an FBI director, she had exposed a structural weakness in how power shields itself. The conversation in press rooms and offices was no longer about whether Patel had been evasive, but about why the system had allowed such a pattern to exist in the first place. People who had spent careers navigating these corridors recognized the danger immediately. When patterns become visible, they rarely disappear quietly. Inside congressional offices, aides began pulling old files, revisiting past oversight hearings, and scanning for references that suddenly felt newly relevant. The directive Murray cited, dated March 22nd, became a focal point, not because it was unprecedented, but because it was precise. It was narrow enough to imply intent and broad enough to affect dozens of documents. Staffers who had once skimmed over classification language now read every line with suspicion. The assumption that such directives were routine no longer held. The whistleblower's role loomed large in these discussions, even without a name. 15 years of experience carried weight, especially in an institution where tenure often correlates with credibility. Murray's choice to protect the analyst while still reading their words into the record created a paradox for Patel's defenders. They could not attack the source without appearing to intimidate a whistleblower, and they could not dismiss the testimony without undermining the integrity of their own classification process. Silence, once again, became the safest option, even as it deepened the impression of guilt. Legal analysts on television began mapping out potential consequences, speaking carefully but pointedly. They explained that reclassification itself is not illegal, but intent matters, patterns matter, and documentation matters most of all. If the reclassifications were shown to obstruct congressional oversight or shield individuals from accountability, the legal implications could be severe. Each explanation circled back to the same uncomfortable truth. Murray had not accused Patel of a single bad decision. She had accused him of orchestrating a system. For Patel, the personal toll became evident as the day unfolded. Friends and allies who might normally offer public support hesitated, issuing carefully worded statements or none at all. The confidence that had carried him into the hearing evaporated under scrutiny. Every photograph from the session was dissected, every pause replayed, every blink scrutinized for meaning. In politics, optics are often unfair, but they are rarely irrelevant. Patel now looked like a man reacting rather than leading. Within the FBI, morale took a quiet hit. Agents and analysts who had dedicated careers to the idea that procedure equals integrity found themselves questioning that assumption. Classification had always been presented as a neutral tool, a safeguard rather than a weapon. Murray's evidence suggested otherwise, implying that the tool itself could be bent, selectively applied, and used to protect those with influence. For an institution built on internal trust, that implication was corrosive. The Epstein connection intensified everything. Even without names, the association carried a weight that transcended partisan lines. Epstein represented not just criminality, but impunity, the sense that wealth and power can insulate individuals from consequences. By tying modern classification decisions to Epstein-related materials, Murray collapsed the distance between past crimes and present governance. It was no longer acceptable to dismiss Epstein as a closed chapter. The chapter was still shaping decisions at the highest levels. As evening approached, pressure mounted for Patel to respond substantively. A written statement was drafted and redrafted, each version softer than the last, stripped of specifics. Advisors debated whether acknowledging the reclassifications outright might blunt criticism or inflame it. Every path seemed risky because the underlying facts were now public. The directive
your answer
existed,
is you just
the documents had
understand
been
you're not gonna follow the law.
reclassified, and the
My answer
timeline
is
was
that I am
clear.
following the law, and I'm
Spin
working
could
with
not erase
interagency
that
partners
reality.
to do this.
Murray,
Get you the
meanwhile,
budget that
remained
you are
largely
required to
silent
have.
after the
And
hearing,
you have no
declining
timeline?
interviews and letting the record
No.
speak for itself. That silence was deliberate, denying opponents the
Well, we
opportunity
also
to
need a
frame her
full budget
actions as
request,
grandstanding.
not a single
By stepping
paragraph
back,
full of wild
she allowed the
talking points
focus
that
to
we saw
remain
with
where
the
she
skinny
had
budget
placed it,
proposal,
on the
and now
documents
having
and
a
the
budget hearing
process.
without a budget
In
request.
Washington,
So,
restraint
Director
often
Patel,
speaks
where
louder
is
than
the FY
outrage.
2026
Her
budget
colleagues
request for the
noticed, and so
FBI?
did the press.
It's
Behind
being worked on,
closed
ma'am.
doors,
Have you
conversations
reviewed it? Have
turned
you
to
approved
next
it?
steps.
Not
Subpoenas
yet.
were discussed,
When will we get it?
timelines sketched
Soon as I
out,
can
committees
get it from my
coordinating
interagency
quietly.
partners and get it
No
approved.
one wanted to move too fast
6
and
months
risk
from now?
procedural missteps,
I don't know, ma'am.
but
My
no
Well,
one
how
wanted
would
to let
we
the
as
moment slip
Congress
away
do our
either.
budget and our work
The
without
balance
that
between
request or without
urgency
this
and
deadline?
caution is always
Ma'am, I'm here,
delicate,
I'm doing the best I
especially
can.
when the
I can't
stakes
make
are
up
this
answers. I'm gonna
high.
commit to you to work on
Murray's
getting you the
evidence had
information you
created
need.
momentum,
That
and
is
momentum demands
insufficient and
direction.
deeply disturbing.
The broader implication began to crystallize as analysts
response?
stepped back from the
I've given
specifics.
my response.
This was not just about Epstein or Patel or even the FBI.
Well, the FBI
It was
is
about
already
the
down
architecture of
1,900
secrecy
employees
itself.
since 2023 as a direct
Classification,
result of the
originally
Fiscal
designed to
Responsibility
protect
Act,
national
and under the
security,
Trump
had become a
administration,
versatile
FBI
shield,
agents,
capable of
analysts,
obscuring
linguists,
uncomfortable
cyber experts, and
truths.
scientists are being asked
Murray's
to do a lot
confrontation
more
forced a
with, in order to
reevaluation of
keep
how
us
that
safe.
shield is
Director
wielded,
Patel,
and
we
who gets
all
to
know
decide when
that budget
transparency
cuts
becomes a
will
threat.
reduce the FBI's ability
Public
to
reaction
counter threats
mirrored
of
this
terrorism,
shift.
and it will
Viewers who
hinder
might
its
normally
ability to
tune
keep
out
pace
hearings
with
found
firearm
themselves
background
engaged,
checks and
not
shutter
because of
operations that
theatrics,
combat
but
violent
because of
crime,
clarity.
drugs, gangs, and transnational
Murray had
or
translated
organized
bureaucratic
crime. Now, I
maneuvering
understand
into
that
a
you told
narrative
our House
anyone could
colleagues yesterday
understand.
that you don't
Documents
want to reduce the
cleared,
FBI
then
workforce,
hidden again,
meaning that
all
you
connected
disagree
to
with the
powerful
president-
names,
what President
all
Trump is
shielded by
proposing?
vague
No, I
invocations
agree
of
that we
security.
can sustain the mission
The
with
story
proposed budget,
resonated
and I
because it
agree
felt
with the budget.
familiar,
And as I
echoing
said
broader
yesterday, I believe
frustrations
it
with
was, I
unaccountable
can do more
power.
with more.
As night
And I
fell,
gave examples
the
of
question
what
was
more
no
we could
longer
do
whether this
if we were
story
given
would
more.
fade.
It's different than what
It
you
was
told
how
the House
deep
yesterday.
it would
So,
go. Murray
what are
had
you
exposed a
communicating to the
seam,
president and the
and
White
once
House about what
seams
you
are
need and what-
visible,
and again, we
they
don't have a
invite
budget request from
pulling.
you, so I'm not sure what you're asking us.
Whistleblowers watching from inside
I'm not asking
agencies
you for
weighed
anything
their
at this time.
options. Lawmakers
can operate
recalibrated
without a
strategies.
never
Journalists
said that.
dug into archives with renewed purpose.
Well, this is
The system Murray described had functioned for years in relative obscurity. That obscurity was gone.
Let me just
For
go to
Patel,
another topic,
the path
since you're not gonna
forward
answer that.
narrowed
The
with
FBI
every
partners
passing
with
hour.
state, local, and
He could
tribal law
continue to
enforcement
deflect,
organizations.
relying on process and
They
time to
provide
dull the
critical
impact,
intelligence and
or he could
operational
engage directly,
capabilities to combat
risking
violent
further
crime and
exposure.
gangs and
Neither
terrorist
option
threats,
promised
fentanyl
safety.
trafficking,
The authority of his
challenges
office,
that
once
our
a
local
source of
communities really
confidence,
can't
now
face
worked
alone.
against him.
I'm gonna give you an
Every
example.
decision
A
he
few
made
years
would be
ago, the
scrutinized
Southeast
through the
Washington
lens Murray had
Safe Streets
provided.
FBI
What lingered
task
from
force
that day
worked
was
with
not a
our
single
Benton County
soundbite,
and Franklin
but a
County
feeling.
Sheriff's Office,
It was the
multiple
feeling that
Tri-Cities
something
police
carefully
departments,
maintained
and
had
the State
begun to
Corrections
crack.
Department to carry out
Murray had
one
not
of
promised
the
justice
largest
or
ever
closure.
drug
She had
seizures
promised
in the region's
accountability.
history.
And in doing
Now
so,
we've got an
she
administration
shifted the
already
burden.
cutting more than
The
800
system now
million
had to
in
explain
assistance
itself.
in
And in
2025
Washington,
to local law
explanations
enforcement
have a way of
organizations
leading to
while proposing
revelations.
a $500 million
By the
cut for
following
FBI.
morning, the
Dr. Patel,
aftershocks
can
had
you
fully set in.
explain to
What
this
had begun
committee
as a tense
how cutting
exchange inside a
resources for our
wood-paneled
local law
hearing room
enforcement
had now
partner agencies
metastasized
the
into
FBI
a full-scale
relies on
crisis of
to help your
credibility.
bureau keep
Overnight,
safe? How do you
editorial
expect the FBI
boards
and local
scrambled
law
to rewrite
enforcement
morning
to do more
drafts,
without
producers
those
reshuffled
significant
rundowns,
resources they need?
and lawmakers
The
awoke to
FBI will
phones
continue
buzzing
to
with
do what it
questions they
does,
could
which
not
is
yet
work
answer.
with embedded state and
The
local law
story had
enforcement
matured
officers
beyond
in
a
our
clip,
Joint Terrorism
beyond a
Task Force
viral
and our
moment,
Safe Streets
into
Task Force
something
and our gang
heavier
task forces.
and more
Those
dangerous.
are a priority. Those
It was no
billets have
longer
been
about what
maintained,
Patty
those
Murray
billets
had
have not been
said,
reduced,
but about what
and with
Kash
my
Patel could
reorientation
no
and
longer
reprogramming
explain away.
that we've notified Congress to,
In
we'll see
Washington,
an
silence is
augmentation in the
often
field in every
strategic,
single state
but
of this
this time it read as surrender.
Again, we need to see
Patel
the
had not
numbers, and we
appeared
need to see that
publicly
budget
since
from
the
you.
hearing ended, and the absence spoke
let me
volumes.
ask you
No
about
confident confident
the
press
NICS
availability,
system.
no
The
calm
FBI is
reassurance
really
from
on
the
the front
director's
lines of
office,
keeping
no
guns out of the hands
authoritative
of very
explanation
dangerous
of the
criminals.
reclassification
The NICS
directive,
serves a
just
really
statements
critical role
carefully
in
laundered through
enhancing national
spokespeople,
security and
heavy on
public
abstract
safety
language
by
and light
conducting
on
background
substance.
checks. You
Each
know
hour
this.
without clarity
They are
deepened the
supported
impression
by
that
the
there was
vast
none to
majority
offer.
of people,
Within the
American
Senate,
people, and I
conversations
wanted
turned
to ask you
sharper.
this morning, will
Members
you
who had
commit to
sat through the
continuing to
hearing
fund
replayed
and
it in their
run the
minds,
FBI
focusing
background
less
check
on Murray's
system?
words than on Patel's reactions.
Thank you.
The hesitation before answering,
I
the
wanna
visible
ask one
strain,
final question
the
here, Mr.
failure to
Chairman.
provide
I
a
wanna talk
coherent
again about how
rationale.
the FBI
Senators
is
who had no
focusing its
political
resources.
incentive to side with Murray
President Trump
nonetheless
has
found
turned the
themselves
Department of Justice
unsettled.
into a tool to go after
Oversight
his perceived
depends on
enemies,
trust,
and
and
many of
trust
the
had
actions
taken a
we
direct
have now
hit.
seen at the FBI
If the
are alarming.
FBI director
The
could not
FBI
explain
has
his own
reassigned
directives
and
under
pushed
oath,
out career
the
FBI
implications reached
agents
far
for
beyond
political
one
reasons.
hearing.
We have seen fear
Murray's
and
staff
intimidation
moved
promoted
deliberately,
throughout
not
the Bureau,
triumphantly.
including
There
by
was no victory lap,
polygraphing your own
no press
staff.
blitz,
We've
no
seen the
attempt
arrest
to
of a
dominate the
sitting
narrative.
judge in Wisconsin.
Instead, they
And
focused
during
on
your
procedure,
confirmation hearing,
preparing formal
you committed that
requests,
there would be
coordinating
no
with committee
politicization,
counsel,
no retribution
ensuring
at the
every
FBI
step
under
was
your
defensible.
leadership. You've
This was not
reportedly
about
placed
scoring
FBI
points.
employees
It was about
responsible for
forcing
investigation
accountability through
January 6
lawful means.
cases on leave.
Murray understood
Is
that the power of what she had done
keeping
lay
up
in
your
its
promise
restraint.
of no
She had
politicization,
asked
no
the
retribution?
questions, placed the evidence
It is
on the
because
record,
that's wildly
and stepped
inaccurate.
back.
Let me tell you what the FBI has
The
done
burden
since I got
now
there.
rested
8,276 federal arrests. To
As
820
analysts
kilograms
continued
seized
to
of fentanyl, that's
dissect
enough
the
to kill
episode,
a
a
quarter million
consensus
people, over
began to
3,000
emerge
firearms
around
seized,
one
350 gang
uncomfortable
cases,
conclusion.
3,000 cases
Patel's
against
problem
violent
was not that he had
Well, that's not my
reclassified
question.
documents.
We know
It was that
you
he
you
had
asked
done
if I was
so in a way
weaponizing
that
the FBI, and
revealed
I am not. I'm giving
intent.
you the hard, concrete
Classification,
examples
when
of the men and women
exercised
putting handcuffs on
impartially,
bad people,
fades
doing
into the
harm to children
background.
and innocent
When
Americans.
exercised
I do
But
not
you
see
selectively,
weaponization.
it leaves
placed on leave
fingerprints.
FBI employees
Murray had followed
responsible
those
for the
fingerprints
investigation of
methodically,
January 6th.
tracing them from a
That sounds
directive to a
political to me.
whistleblower
I have
statement
not placed
to a set of
anyone on
documents
leave
bound by a
who has
single
not
explosive
violated their
theme.
ethical obligation or
The
their
list of
oath to
17
So,
names,
if they were
though
investigating
unseen,
January
became a
6th, you believe
character
they
in
were
its own
violating
right.
an ethic obligation?
Its
Nope.
mere
I think the
existence
common
fueled
theme here is you putting
speculation,
words in my
not
mouth,
because
and
of
I'm not gonna
rumor,
tolerate it,
but
nor
because
will
of
men and women of the
process.
FBI.
A list
Well, you
compiled
did
from
place on leave an
reclassified
analyst
documents
responsible for
submitted under
investigating
seal
Russia's meddling in the
demanded follow-up.
2016 election. Is
Lawmakers
that
knew that
politicization? Is
sealed
that
records have a
retribution?
way of
No,
resurfacing,
not if she broke
especially
the law or
when
the ethical
oversight
guidelines. I don't know which
intensifies.
case you're talking about, but
The
that's
names would
standard.
not remain
We will hold
abstract
ourselves
forever.
inwardly accountable,
They would
and we will
emerge
not
through
be
subpoenas,
strayed
court
from our mission
filings,
because people
or
think we're
investigative
politicizing the
reporting.
Bureau. If you wanna
Time,
talk about someone
not
who was
secrecy,
attacked by a weaponized
was now
bureau,
the enemy.
You're looking at him, and now he's
For the
director of
public,
the FBI,
the
and he's
hearing
cleaning it up.
crystallized a long,
Well, I would
simmering
just
suspicion.
say to everyone who's listening
Many
that the
Americans had
FBI
grown
needs to be
cynical about
focused on
institutions
its
that seem
mission
to protect the
keep entire
powerful
country
while
safe.
preaching
It should
accountability.
not be weaponized for partisan
Murray's
political
confrontation
gain.
gave that
We are.
cynicism a concrete shape.
Kennedy.
It was not an abstract feeling anymore. It was 37 documents, a directive dated March 22nd, and an FBI director unable to answer a yes or no question. The simplicity of that contrast made it resonate far beyond political insiders. Inside the FBI, quiet recalculations continued. Agents and analysts who had followed orders now wondered how history would judge those decisions. Classification had always been framed as duty, not discretion. Yet Murray's evidence suggested discretion had played a central role. That realization carried a moral weight few had anticipated. Institutions are sustained not just by rules, but by belief in their fairness. When that belief erodes, the damage is slow but profound. Pressure mounted for congressional action, and it came not from outrage, but from expectation. Oversight committees exist to ask precisely these kinds of questions, and now one had been asked in full view of the nation. To do nothing would be to validate the very system Murray had exposed. Discussions of hearings, subpoenas, and document releases accelerated, driven by the understanding that delay would only strengthen suspicion. Transparency, once demanded, is difficult to deny without consequence. Patel's options narrowed further. Resignation, once unthinkable, entered quiet conversations as a hypothetical. Not because guilt had been established, but because leadership requires confidence, and confidence had been badly shaken. Even if Patel remained in office, his authority was compromised. Every future classification decision would be scrutinized, every assertion of national security questioned. The shield he had relied on had become a spotlight. What lingered most powerfully from the hearing was the moment of silence after Murray asked about Epstein. Those seconds had become symbolic, replayed endlessly, analyzed from every angle. Silence, in that context, was not neutral. It was heavy with implication. It suggested calculation, fear, and the realization that the usual defenses would not hold. For viewers, it was the sound of power confronted by its limits. Murray's closing message, repeated in coverage and commentary, echoed long after the hearing ended. This was not about vengeance or spectacle. It was about whether a democracy can tolerate a system in which evidence disappears behind labels that no longer mean what they once did. It was about whether national security can be invoked to protect reputations rather than people. By forcing those questions into the open, Murray had shifted the terrain of the debate. The story did not end with the gavel. It moved into courtrooms, committee rooms, and newsrooms, carried forward by documents that now demanded daylight. Murray had fired the opening shot, not with rhetoric, but with records. The implications would unfold slowly, unevenly, but inexorably. Once the pattern was seen, it could not be unseen. And so the hearing entered history not as a shouting match or a partisan clash, but as a rare moment of clarity, a senator with evidence, an FBI director without answers, and a system exposed by its own mechanisms. The truth did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, in directives and memos and silences, but it arrived nonetheless. One hearing at a time, one document at a time, the wall began to crack, and those who had relied on its thickness realized, too late, that it was never as solid as they believed.